in the dimmest corner of a strip mall slated for demolition, where the fluorescent lights flickered like they were debating between living and dying, an old black man walked into a karate class at 3:58 p.m., 2 minutes early, but half a century too late. The glass door groaned open, ushering in a gust laced with the smell of old rubber mats and the sweat of youth. He wore a faded khaki jacket, moved slowly but without trembling, a wooden cane reaching his knee, the only thing left in his body that still stood straight. Inside the dojo, young students were stretching, hopping, their crisp white uniforms snapping like wind cracking against untested confidence. They glanced at him, then turned away, the kind of turn reserved for things that clearly don't concern you. No one asked his name, only the young receptionist typed without looking up. "Senior classes are next door. Sir, not here." He didn't respond, just looked at the large mirror at the back wall, where a different man stared back, taller, firmer, with eyes that once knew what fear was and had chosen to stand anyway. But that man had died a long time ago, one April afternoon in Memphis, where bullets never needed reasons to ring out. People came here to learn how to fight. Elijah Boone came to learn how to endure. You want to know who he used to be? No need, because in this country, sometimes old black men are not allowed to have a past. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story is one you don't want to miss. His cane tapped lightly against the tiled floor, a dry, hollow sound, like a knock from a world long forgotten. No one turned when he walked in. They had already seen him through the glass door, the long shadow of a man who no longer carried threat, only time. In this city, old black men didn't show up in places like this. They belonged in dusty barbershops on the South Side, spinning Nixon-era stories, or sitting on porches outside assisted living homes, counting pigeons. Not in a dojo bleached white from the uniforms to the skin. Elijah Boone stood still for a moment. He set the wooden cane against the wall, carefully, like laying down part of himself for a rest. Under the flickering fluorescent lights, his face looked like ash after fire. Not sad, not angry, just ash once fire. No need to prove it now. Sensei Martin stepped over, tall, rigid, a man built like a flagpole. He had been a Marine, and that was the first thing he told every class. It was also the last thing he wanted anyone to forget. "You looking for someone?" Martin's tone wasn't hostile, just used to being obeyed. "I'm here for the beginner class, afternoon slot," Elijah replied. Martin raised an eyebrow. "You sure this class isn't gentle? And how old are you?" Elijah lifted his chin slightly, as if hearing the question clearly but long accustomed to its irrelevance. "I'm not here to learn how to fight. I'm here to remember something." Martin chuckled, a polite, clipped laugh, one that never reached the chest. He turned to the receptionist, Emily. "Get him a sign-up form." "And what size, Gay?" Elijah scanned the room, eyes landing on the youngest student, a 10-year-old boy staring like he'd just watched someone step out of a black and white war film. Elijah squinted, then looked away. As he walked toward the desk, the younger students all shifted back half a step. Not much, not noticeable, but enough to create space. In a room barely 40 square meters wide, that space roared like thunder. Emily handed him a pen. Elijah took it. He wrote his name with the careful strokes of a dried-up river, slow, steady, still flowing. Elijah Lafayette Boone. She typed Eli Boone. He didn't correct her. He was used to it. The new uniform smelled of bleach and synthetic fiber. Elijah changed in the cramped back locker room. It took him nearly 10 minutes to fold his old clothes, not because he was feeble, but because he believed in one thing that others had forgotten. If you can't control the world outside, at least fold your shirt properly. When he stepped out, the white uniforms looked like fresh snow across the room. Elijah was the only stain, and he knew it. Martin gave him a quick once-over, trained anywhere before. Elijah nodded. "Long ago, but I only finished half." "Why only half?" "Because the man who taught me was shot on a balcony." Martin paused, not sure whether to believe him or ignore it. Eventually, he said, "All right, back row. Take it easy. Say something if you need to stop." Elijah said nothing. He moved toward the back row. As he took his spot, the guy next to him, broad shoulders, named Chad, snorted. "You okay, Grandpa? There's an elevator upstairs if the stairs were too much." Elijah stared straight ahead. No reaction, no turn of the head. He just stood there, feet planted wide, arms relaxed. His posture was as straight as his cane earlier, but without leaning on the wall. The class began, voices shouted, feet slammed, uniforms cracked the air like whips. Elijah just stood, relearning how to breathe, inhale, hold, exhale, not to win, not to prove. Just because he once forgot how to breathe, one April afternoon long ago, when a friend fell and he couldn't stop it. His name was typed wrong on the class list, Eli Boone. No accent, no center, no roots. When Emily printed out the new roster and pinned it to the wooden board near the training hall, Elijah looked at the shortened version of his name as if he were staring at a smaller, poorer replica of himself, a copy stripped of memory. But he didn't correct it. Not because he didn't care, but because he had lived his whole life carrying names that weren't really his. In a hospital in 1982, a nurse wrote it as Elijah Boone. In 1997, on a rental form in Georgia, he was listed as E. Bunn. In his military file, they had left out Lafayette, his middle name, his distant niece. She just called him that old man at Mama Anna's. Elijah once thought he would resist, correct every letter, reclaim every syllable, but then he realized when people don't believe you deserve your real name, correcting it feels like writing on water. Every word washes away. The first week passed like a dream without a break in the middle. Every Tuesday afternoon, he arrived 10 minutes early, always stood in the last row, no small talk, no reaction. When Sensei Martin called out Kumite basic forms, the younger students snapped their arms, flung their legs, stomped with force like they were trying to split bricks. Elijah moved a third of the way, as if holding something back, as if some part of him wasn't ready to surface. One afternoon, Chad, the bulky kid with a smirk for everyone, leaned over just loud enough for Elijah to hear. I don't think he even understands the Japanese words. Laughter trickled through the young students like scissors slicing through dignity. Elijah didn't turn around, but that night, he stood alone in the laundry room, tracing the movements of Heian Shodan, whispering each syllable, Geten Barai, Oizuki, Eiji Uke. Each word landed like a tap on the cement floor clack. 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 He didn't need the class to remember, just empty space and silence. Lena, the only one who greeted him with her eyes, didn't speak much, but once, after class, she came over and handed him a cold towel. Elijah accepted it with a slight nod. She didn't ask why he trained. He didn't ask what she was running from. In that dojo, everyone was running from something. Some ran from the fear of weakness, others from bodies not yet shaped. Elijah was running from the death of memory. Once, Lena whispered, I think, when you walked in, everyone thought you didn't belong. But maybe you're the only one who knows exactly where you are. Elijah didn't respond. He only said, knowing where you are is one thing, being allowed to stay there is another. By the second week, they started partner drills. Elijah was paired with a young man named Tyson Quick, muscular, untouched by real hits. Tyson bumped him with the shoulder on the first go. The second time, a harder shove. The third, a warning. You better keep up, old man. I won't be responsible if something lands too hard. Elijah paused, stepped back half a pace, then bowed. His eyes dropped, but his voice rose enough for the nearby students to hear. Nothing's hit me harder than time, son. Tyson snickered, but on the next move, he missed, slipped, and lost balance. Thud. His body slammed into the mat like a hammer on pride. Elijah didn't laugh. He turned to his left, bowed not to Tyson, but to the floor, as if apologizing to the ground. One late afternoon, Sensei Martin addressed the class. Write a short note explaining why you're studying karate. We'll read them out loud next week. Elijah took the blank sheet and the pen. He sat alone in the corner of the dojo after class, his hand trembling slightly. Not from age, but because what he was about to write no longer had a place in this world. The pen scraped gently across the paper, like carving lines into dry wood. In the end, he wrote only this: I train so I don't forget what I once knew. I train so I don't forgive what I once forgot. I train because once I didn't lift my arm to block a bullet and someone else died in my place. Elijah Boone. He folded the paper carefully, did not turn it in, just slipped it into his shirt pocket, each crease sealed like a quiet sentence without trial. That night, he opened an old drawer. At the bottom was a worn-out ID card, a black and white photo of a younger man, eyes sharp as a blade. The name on the card, Elijah Boone, not wrong, not shortened, not missing. He stared at it for a long time, then slipped it back into a tin box. When he shut the lid, it snapped with a click, like closing a drawer of memory that had been left open too long. He didn't need anyone to remember his name. He just needed not to forget it himself. Not all scars live on the skin. Some dwell quietly inside, like broken thorns lodged beneath the flesh, impossible to pull out. Elijah had one like that somewhere under his left rib. It never showed up in scans, but every time the weather shifted, it flared up like a wordless reminder you're still alive, but never whole. That morning, he woke to the thump-thump of the old air conditioner rattling off balance, and felt the old pain return like an uninvited friend. It didn't stab or twist. It just lingered persistent, like a rumor that won't die, looping inside the skull. When Elijah stepped into the dojo, his gait had a slight hitch. Lena noticed. She started to speak, but he shook his head. In the language of those who've survived loss, that shake meant I'm okay, as long as I'm not lying down yet. That day's lesson was reflex drills. Sensei Martin paired students off to practice basic counter-strikes. Elijah was matched with Chad, the one who never liked that he was there. Chad chuckled when he heard the pairing. Great. I'll be careful not to break any bones. The chuckle rippled backward like beads clacking on stone. The first strike, Chad moved slowly, performing generosity. Elijah dodged it, said nothing. The second came faster, heavier. Elijah stepped back half a pace, raised his left arm by reflex, then froze. The pain under his rib felt like someone pulling a rope tight inside him. Crack, a soft sound, like a joint slipping or a memory misaligned. Elijah tilted but did not fall. Chad laughed aloud. You okay there, old man? Sensei Martin glanced over, didn't intervene. Some challenges, he believed, were meant to be faced alone. Elijah took a breath, slow, deep, then straightened his spine. The third strike came, he didn't block, didn't move, just stood still. Chad flinched, missed, lost his balance. Thud, the flat slap of a foot sliding across the mat. Elijah said nothing, just stepped back slightly. His eyes weren't angry, weren't cold. They looked like doors locked from the inside. That night, Elijah returned to his room, pulled out an old worn towel and pressed it against his side. The mirror reflected a body that was once a fortress, now a ruin. Faded bruises, faint fractures, a crescent-shaped scar just below his sternum. It wasn't from a blade. It came from a fall not in the dojo, but in life. 1968, Memphis. He never told anyone, but that scar buried the name of a man he once protected, a man who died standing beside him. A bullet tore through the spring air, split an unfinished speech, and shattered the entire concept of responsibility. Elijah still remembered the smell of gunpowder, the scream, but the part that haunted him most was what came after the silence, thick as riverbed silt. And the eyes of the man, as blood began to spread across his white shirt, eyes that didn't blame, but didn't forgive either. The next day, Lena invited Elijah for tea after class. They sat in a small shop where the radio buzzed with static. The tables were chipped wood, and the light glowed the color of old pages. Lena talked more than usual. I think karate isn't just for defense. It's a way to preserve the part of you no one's touched yet. Elijah looked into his tea. The steam rose thin, like the last breath of a fading memory. He said, "You're right, but sometimes there's no part left to defend." Lena didn't respond. She just poured more tea, a small gesture, but the tink-tink of liquid hitting porcelain sounded like a clock counting down. One evening, the dojo held a review for the belt exam. Elijah didn't sign up. He didn't say why. No one asked. They all assumed he was too old. Nothing left to prove. While the others drilled their forms, Elijah stood alone in the corner, practicing breathwork the old way, counting in time with wind, with memory. Inhale rustle like wind slipping under a warped door. Hold. Exhale foo, like a soft sigh from someone who's waited too long. Sensei Martin passed by, paused for a beat. He didn't speak, but his glance held a suspicion long worn dull by quiet perseverance. As the class ended, Martin asked him quietly, "Did you ever test for a belt before?" Elijah replied without looking up, eyes fixed on the cane resting against the wall. "I did, but not in a training hall." Martin nodded. No further questions. That night, Elijah dreamed of Memphis again. No blood, no gunshot, just himself, standing on a balcony, seeing a younger version of him faster, stronger but frozen. Everything held still, as if time had congealed, and the other man, the one who died, just looked at him, then stepped backward into the dark. When Elijah woke, dawn had not yet broken. The drizzle tapped plop-plop against the tin roof. He sat upright, spine aching, but eyes clear. No more sorrow, no more regret. Only emptiness like a dojo floor before the first footstep. Every dojo has its own rhythm, not the rhythm of feet or the sound of shouted commands, but the invisible beat of patience. This dojo was no different, and Elijah noticed it after 3 weeks sideways glances, soft chuckles, the silence when he walked past each with its own tempo, a song no one composed, but everyone played. That Wednesday afternoon, the dojo floor carried the scent of damp cloth and old sweat. Elijah sat in the corner, legs stretched out, his cane propped against the wall like a quiet companion. A breeze slipped through the doorframe, bringing with it the smell of rotting wood from the hallway, a smell familiar to those who've lived too long in places no one remembers. Sensei Martin began class with a group warm-up. Lena was absent. Chad, as usual, glanced at Elijah with a half smirk. This time, there was someone new Drew, a tall, blonde student, his gaze polished like forged steel. Elijah recognized that look right away, not hostile, but filled with the unconscious certainty of being better. When Martin paired students for reflex drills, Elijah was matched with Drew. The young man bowed properly, but his eyes lingered on Elijah's worn shoes. The first strike came lightly a test. Elijah dodged it with a smoothness so subtle it might have gone unnoticed. Drew raised an eyebrow. The second strike. Harder. Elijah blocked it with his elbow. Smack. The dry sound echoed in the air. A brief pause, then again. The third move. Drew spun suddenly, launching a high kick. Elijah stepped back just enough for the air to whisper past his face. The whole class froze for a second. No one said a word, but something had shifted, like the squeak of a door sliding open to let light flood a long darkened room. That evening, Lena called Elijah. She said only one sentence: "I saw it." Elijah didn't ask what she saw. He replied, "Don't tell me. Some things only survive in silence." On the other end, there was only the static hum of an old air conditioner and the faint sound of a swallowed sigh. The next week, during a midday class, the dojo floor was slick from a leaky vent. A young student slipped and fell. Thump. Laughter followed. But Elijah stepped forward, lifted the boy without a word, just held out his hand. That small gesture didn't just raise a child, it lowered the ego of the crowd. The boy bowed. "Thank you, sir." Elijah nodded. "Don't apologize for falling, only for not getting back up." That sentence moved through the dojo like scripture. No one repeated it, but everyone remembered. That same afternoon, a female student quietly arranged the mats after class. Drew stepped aside to let Elijah pass in the narrow hallway near the changing room. No one spoke, but silence has shape, and that shape was shifting. At the end of the month, Sensei Martin called Elijah to the center of the dojo. No one knew why. Martin presented a kata not difficult, but one that demanded precision, control, and restraint. Elijah stepped forward, no shouting, no flair. Each movement was half a beat slower than expected, but each carried weight, as if behind every strike, he was dragging a door of memory behind him. Thud, crack, rustle. The sounds weren't loud, but they lingered. Each snap of fabric was a story from a time no one had bothered to listen. When he finished, the dojo remained silent, no applause, but the eyes had changed. Chad bowed his head. Drew looked away. Sensei Martin nodded slightly and said, "It's not the strongest who are the best. It's the ones who don't need to prove anything anymore." Elijah bowed, his eyes lowered, not out of humility, but as if seeing someone else, someone younger standing in the same spot, someone he once was, someone he had once lost. That night, as Elijah left the dojo, rain began to fall. It came light as silk, but cold like an unfinished dream. He didn't raise an umbrella, let the rain soak his shoulders, his neck, his back, as if each drop was a memory being rinsed not to forget, but to remember without hurting. Along the dark street from the dojo to his room, his footsteps merged with the plop-plop of rain on tin eaves. A black cat crossed silently in front of him. Elijah stopped, stared for a moment, as if recognizing something or someone slipping past in the night. Saturday morning, the dojo was emptier than usual. Sunlight sliced through the glass windows like pale yellow cuts on the scuffed wooden floor. Elijah arrived earlier than usual and sat alone beside the plastic chair near the water cooler. His GI had been washed so many times it no longer looked white, but rather the gray of endurance. On the left breast of his uniform, a small patch had been freshly sewn. No one knew who had done it, only that it bore an old symbol, 3 red bars crossed by a single black line. It wasn't the school's logo, nor was it a belt rank. A curious student asked about it. Elijah simply said, "It used to mean something. Now, it doesn't need to." Throughout the session, more eyes glanced his way. No longer with contempt, but not yet with respect. The kind of hesitant gaze society gives to those outside the system, no rank, no registration, no social media clips of flying kicks. Martin let him warm up on his own. Didn't call his name, but when it came time for sparring, Elijah was paired with Martin himself. The class paused, if only for a second, when it happened. Martin stepped forward, bowed properly. Elijah returned the bow. No words, no pursed lips, just air passing between two men, one who lived by command, the other by memory. The first strike came fast. Elijah blocked it. No counter. The second, Martin swept in low with a leg. Elijah pivoted, not dodging, not striking only as if he'd known the move before it began. The third strike never came. Martin halted mid-motion, nodded, and said quietly, "You didn't strike, but I get it now." Elijah bowed his head. Not gratitude, not apology, just a period in a sentence that needed no words. As class ended, a group of 3 younger students lingered in the corner. They spoke quietly, but Elijah heard every word. Was he really a bodyguard? Someone said he used to work with some preacher. Maybe he was a deserter. Elijah walked past, slowly, like moving down a corridor of wind. He said nothing, but a student named Riley spoke up. "If he hasn't told you, maybe it's because you're not meant to know. And if you need to know to show respect, you're not ready to learn." No one replied. Elijah kept walking. His shadow stretched across the wooden floor, broken into fragments by the sunlight through the window bars. That night, he opened the tin box. Inside were old papers, handwritten letters, a hand-drawn map, and a black and white photo of 3 people standing in front of a churchyard. One of them was Elijah, younger, with eyes that still believed in something. He flipped the photo over. The writing had faded. Brother Elijah, Memphis, April 1968. In another old envelope, he found a patch identical to the one on his gi. 3 red lines, 1 black slash, a forgotten emblem, a vow no one remembered, a time when martial arts weren't just technique, but a way of preserving faith. Sunday. The dojo was closed. Elijah walked to the nearby park, sat on a stone bench and watched runners. children shouting, dogs barking, and the wind blowing fallen leaves across the path like restless memories refusing to sleep. A boy, maybe 8, kicked a ball that rolled to Elijah's feet. He bent down, picked it up, and before handing it back, turned it slowly in his hand, as if feeling the roundness of something that could return from any direction. Then he passed it back without a word. The boy thanked him. His parents, standing at a distance, looked on uncertain whether to be afraid, grateful, or simply ignore him. At the next class, Martin announced there would be an open demonstration at the end of the month. Anyone interested could sign up. Elijah didn't sign, but 3 others, Drew, Riley, and a quiet Asian student named Kenji, sat beside him after class. "We'd like you to perform with us, a shared kata." Elijah looked at them for a long moment, then said, "If I stand with you, I won't bow to the audience. I don't perform. I just do what I once believed to be true." Drew nodded. "We're not asking you to bow, just to stand with us." Back in his room, Elijah took out the old photo again and studied it. He remembered the first time he had stood in front of a crowd not to perform, but to protect. He remembered the sound of shoes striking hot pavement, the chants of protest, and the mix of fear and awe in the eyes behind car windows. He remembered shielding a white boy from a police baton just because the boy had sat in the wrong place. He remembered the friend who died for standing in the wrong moment. And he remembered the promise he'd made to himself, never again to show up just to be part of someone else's stage. But then he looked again at these new faces, these steady, young steps trying to walk the right path, and he nodded. Not for them, but for himself, for the Elijah who had once been led through the dark by someone else's hand. The air in the dojo at the end of the month carried a quiet tension, like the vibration of a guitar string never plucked, but already resonating. An old wooden board hung by the door, reading "Open Demonstration, Saturday, 5 p.m., below it, a list of student names, held by 2 rusted pins. Elijah's name wasn't on it, but everyone knew he would be at the center. On Thursday afternoon, Martin called 4 people into a small room, a narrow space with a crooked picture on the wall, a wooden chair, and the lingering scent of old green tea. He spoke plainly. "Each of you chooses your part. No synchronization, no choreography, just truth." Riley was the first to speak. "I'll open with the newest Kata Heian Godan. Strong, fast." Kenji nodded. "I'll do a traditional Shotokan form. Slow, steady." Drew added, "I want to perform a paired sequence non-contact sparring." Martin turned to Elijah. "And you?" Elijah didn't answer right away. His fingers gently touched the patch sewn on his chest, eyes not looking at anyone, but staring through the wooden wall toward another time. "I don't choose, I repeat what once helped me survive." Martin nodded, asked nothing more. On the day of the demonstration, the dojo was unusually crowded. Parents, guests, passers-by, even those who knew nothing about martial arts, squeezed onto the old wooden benches. No one wanted to miss whatever was about to unfold, even if they didn't know what it was. The mic buzzed with crackling static as Martin took hold of it. He didn't introduce the performers. He didn't read bios. He simply said, "The people standing before you today are not here to show strength. They're here to hold on to what they believe through hands, feet, and silence." Then he stepped back. Riley went first. Her steps echoed thunk-thunk across the wooden floor. She began the kata as if slicing the air into pieces. Each strike came with the hiss of fabric, sharp and precise. At the end, she bowed lightly, no smile. Kenji followed, his kata flowing like a current. Each move seemed carved out of time. Someone in the audience began to breathe slower, as if he was teaching them how to stand still in a moving world. Then Drew and Riley entered together. They faced each other in sparring stance. No contact, but every shift of footing stretched tight like a drawn bow. A kick stopped a hair's width from the face. A punch halted at the chest, not because it lacked force, but because it had control. The audience held its breath. No applause. Just a collective "oh" like wind skimming the surface of a still pond. And then Elijah stepped forward. He didn't bow, didn't smile, didn't shout commands. He simply stood a body the color of time, eyes that searched for nothing, only held everything. His left hand lifted slow as a winter morning. The right followed. No one knew what kata he was doing. It had no name, no style, only motion, the kind belonging to someone who once fought not to win, but to stay alive. Thud, hiss, slide. Sounds dropped like scattered memories on the floor. He turned, bent a knee, struck low, then pivoted high, as if each move was a prayer spoken by a soul with no language left. His eyes didn't meet the crowd. They searched for someone or some version of himself who had long retreated. But in the final moment, he paused, straightened, closed his eyes. His left hand gripped the empty air before his chest, where his heart had once been abandoned. No one clapped, but no one left. After the demonstration, night had fallen. Light rain fell like silver dust. Elijah remained in the dojo, alone, beside the cane resting against the wall. Lena walked in, coat soaked, hair undone. She said nothing, just sat beside him. They sat that way for a long while. Finally, she asked, "That Kata, who did you learn it from?" Elijah answered, "I didn't learn it. I lived with it. It's what was left when everything else had fallen away." Lena asked no more, but her gaze had changed as though she'd seen something she wasn't sure she believed, but knew she'd never forget. That night, back in his room, Elijah opened the tin box again, but this time, he didn't take anything out. He simply closed the lid. Click, soft, then placed it back in the drawer. For the first time, he didn't look back. On the table, a small note lay waiting, left by Riley. "I don't need to know who you once were, but I'll always remember who you were today." Elijah read it, then folded it. He didn't put it in the box. He left it beneath the water glass, where the window light glinted, and he sat there, not sleeping, just listening to the rain, as if someone were tapping each drop on the roof, reminding him that the past may ache, but the present is still breathing. The next morning, the dojo was closed for Sunday, but Elijah still walked past it, as if the habit had fused into his tendons. The door was locked, the curtains drawn. Only sunlight slid lazily across the faded wood. He paused, staring for a long time, not because he'd forgotten the way, but as if waiting for a whisper from within. Then he kept walking. His worn shoes tapped gently against the sidewalk, like a reminder that he was still here. No one called his name, but he kept walking, like the old days with no name, only duties. Back home, he made tea, not from a bag, loose leaves, bought from an Asian shop on the west side of town. He boiled water in a cast iron kettle, the soft bloop of simmering rising like memory being coaxed awake. The scent rose and touched the roof of his nose, pulling with it slivers of memory he would never write down. On the table sat the note Riley had left the day before. He rested his hand on the words, as if truth could be felt through skin, not because it surprised him, but because it was real, and in his life, truth had always come at a cost. That afternoon, Martin called. "I know you don't like noise, but someone needs to see you, not a student, an old one." Elijah didn't ask for a name. He simply said, "I'll be there at 5. The man was already waiting outside the dojo, brown skin, salt and pepper hair, dark suit jacket, no tie, deep eyes, a gaze that didn't flinch. Elijah recognized him instantly. Darnell. 40 years, no letters, no calls, just one passing glimpse at someone else's funeral, and now he stood there, as if the past could schedule appointments. "I heard you still train. I didn't believe it, but I had to see for myself." Elijah said nothing. They entered the dojo. No lights. Only natural slivers of light through the shutters. "I brought this." Darnell pulled a photograph from his jacket pocket. Blurred, silver-tinted, 3 people, one gone, one unrecognizable, and one still standing. Elijah. "I kept it because I owe, and because I remember that punch." Elijah sat down, hands on his knees. The story didn't need telling. That death, the man who shielded, the man who froze, the one who turned away, everyone had a part, but not everyone had the courage to carry it for life. Elijah did. That's what brought men like Darnell back. You still remember the old Kata, the one we practiced outside the church? Elijah nodded, slowly, then stood. No words, just posture, a beginning move, hands lifting just like the night before. But this time, he faced an opponent. Not Darnell, but time itself. Ego, the punches that had never been thrown. Darnell followed, almost in sync, but different faster, sharper, as if trying to rewrite history with speed. Halfway through, Elijah stopped, not from exhaustion, but because he understood the past doesn't need fixing. It needs facing, breathing, and letting go. I don't throw that punch anymore. I don't need to. Darnell looked at him, then lowered his hands. 2. When they left the dojo, the sun had just slipped away. The last light made the pavement look like trembling water. Darnell gripped Elijah's hand. I won't come back, but I won't forget either. Elijah nodded, gently, no promises, just the quiet memory of being remembered. That night, Elijah reopened the tin box. This time, he pulled out an old scrap of paper. No photo, no writing, just raw, yellowed paper, a faint blood stain at one corner. He folded it, slid it into his shirt pocket, then took his cane, left the house. Not to the dojo. He went farther, past 3 streets, over a bypass, to a small park near the train station. There, he practiced alone. No lights, no music, only the faint glow of street lamps and the rustle of dry leaves underfoot. Each strike was slow, but firm, as if he were etching something into the air that no one else could see. A child passed by, walking a dog. The boy stopped, stared. Elijah paused, nodded. The boy didn't flinch. He nodded back, then walked on. The next morning, Elijah didn't show up at the dojo, but some students spoke quietly among themselves. Someone had seen him training in the park. At dawn, no uniform, but each movement like a song that needed no instrument. Riley smiled when she heard. Lena said nothing, but her eyes shimmered slightly. Elijah never told anyone, but that night, he slept deeply. No dreams, no tossing, as if everything, even the final punch, had finally found a place to be laid down. On the small door that led to the dojo's equipment room, there was a tiny metal vent, not large, just wide enough for a sliver of light to pass through, and sometimes just wide enough for a single gaze. No one noticed it, except one person. After the demonstration, the dojo resumed its regular schedule, but something in the air had changed. Elijah still showed up on time, silent, standing in the back row, but that silence was no longer concealment. It was like a vacuum that drew every eye. Everyone saw him, and no one knew what to say. Sensei Martin spoke even less. Sometimes, he simply watched Elijah warm up, then turned away. Once, he corrected Chad's stance, but his eyes never left Elijah. In the equipment room, among old pads and broken fans, sat a boy named Nico. His mother cleaned the dojo each afternoon. While she mopped the floor, Nico would slip into that room, perch on a plastic stool, and press his eye to the vent, watching the class through the narrow slit. The boy knew nothing of martial arts, but he knew fear, and when he saw Elijah for the first time, he was afraid. Not because the man was frightening, but because he was too still, like a beast that no longer roared, but had never stopped remembering. One rainy afternoon, thunder cracked outside, water dripped, plink, plink, from the dojo's leaking roof. Elijah arrived late, his step uneven, sleeves wet. Martin looked but asked nothing. Lena walked over, offering a dry towel. Behind the door, Nico held his breath. He followed every movement, every breath, and for the first time, he saw Elijah smile, a brief flicker, when Lena said something before turning away, but Nico had seen it. Elijah began the old kata. No one had asked. He moved through it like an unspoken thank you. Nico saw his hands tremble, but the strikes were still precise. When the final kick landed, Nico clapped once. A single clap, small, but it rang through the dojo like a soft knock of reverence. Martin turned. Lena looked up. Elijah stood still, The room paused. "Who's there?" The door creaked open. Nico stepped out, head bowed. "I'm sorry, I was just watching." Martin didn't scold. Lena smiled. Elijah stepped forward, bent down, and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "If you're still watching, you're already learning." From that day on, Nico was allowed to sit in the corner of the dojo each afternoon. Not officially. No uniform, just a straw mat and eyes that never left Elijah. One day, Martin handed him an old notebook, blank, and a pen. "Write down what you see. Don't write it correctly. Write it truthfully." Nico nodded. On the first page, he wrote, "He doesn't fight to win. He fights like he's searching for something he lost." In a later class, Drew approached Elijah and handed him a small invitation card. "My school is hosting a community martial arts talk. I'd like you to speak not about technique, about why." Elijah looked at the card, didn't nod, didn't shake his head, but he tucked it into his shirt pocket, next to Riley's old note. That weekend, the dojo was quieter, Martin was out, Lena had an exam, Elijah trained alone, but Nico came anyway, sat in the corner, scribbling something in the notebook. When Elijah stopped, Nico approached, notebook in hand. "I have a question." Elijah nodded. "Why don't you teach I see others who are skilled, but you're the only one who doesn't speak? You just move." Elijah looked at the notebook, then sat beside the boy. "Because words can be cut, but true motion that can't be. But what if no one sees it? If you see it, that's enough." That night, Elijah stood on the balcony of his boarding room. Below, lights blinked through soft rain. He laid Riley's note beside Drew's invitation. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but because for the first time, he was considering stepping into another room. And he knew the next kata would not be inside the dojo. It would be somewhere else, in front of strangers who didn't know his name, but maybe just maybe were waiting for something, a punch, a gaze, a quiet kind of patience that didn't require words. The small hall was nestled inside an old community center tin roof, weak yellow lights, plastic chairs were lined up in rows, none of them quite straight. The scraping sounds of late arrivals, chairs dragging, shoes tapping the old stone floor, played like an improvised symphony. On stage, there was no podium, just a slightly crooked mat and a microphone on a stand, still off. Elijah entered from the side door. No one recognized him at first, just an old man in a gray shirt, cane in hand, but when he passed the front row, Lena stood up, Riley nodded, Drew tapped Kenji's shoulder, they all knew. The organizer motioned for Elijah to come forward. The audience waited for him to speak, but he didn't reach for the mic. He just stood there, breathing, looking into the eyes that waited. Silence fell on the room like a cloth draped over a once loud instrument. "I'm not here to teach karate, and I'm not much of a storyteller." He began in a low, steady voice, not loud, but it resonated. "I used to think silence meant failure, that if I didn't speak, no one would know, but some things, the more you speak of them, the more they slip away, like water in your hands." He looked at Drew. "When I was young, I trained to win, to be stronger than the next man, to be seen." Then at Riley. "Later, I trained to preserve what others had already lost." And then to Lena. "Now, I train just so I don't forget who I am." No one interrupted, no phones buzzed, no air conditioner clicked, just his voice, and the sound of his cane tapping the floor as he shifted. "I didn't bring a kata tonight, but I brought memory." He stepped down from the mat, stood among them. "I once stood between a bullet and a speech, and I didn't stop it." All eyes were on him. Still, Elijah didn't raise his voice. He simply lifted his arm, mimicking a basic block. Some blows don't come from fists, they come from the silence of people who should have spoken. He paused, 1 second, 2, then glanced toward the back of the room where a few teenagers were giggling. I don't blame anyone who laughed at a funeral. I used to be the kid who laughed while others cried, not because I was cruel, but because I didn't know yet that pain always finds its way to you. The room fell still. I didn't learn martial arts to strike back. I learned it to endure without breaking, so that when everything leaves me, youth, strength, even my name, I still have one thing left, conviction that doesn't need permission. He bowed his head. No farewell, no wave, just turned toward the door. Then came one clap, not loud, but true, then more, then many. Applause rolled in, but Elijah was already gone. That night, he didn't head straight home. He walked through the old streets where the black-owned bookstore had once stood, where he and a long-gone friend used to sit after marches. The air was cold. Smoke from a street vendor's hot dog cart wafted past like an unfinished chapter of memory. He stopped in front of a martial arts store. In the window belts of all colors, white, yellow, orange, green, brown, black, arranged perfectly, polished, not a single fray. Elijah stared, not out of envy, but as if he were checking something inside himself. Then he turned to leave, but at the corner, under a flickering street lamp, he turned again, executed a short kata. Not strong, not perfect, just enough to say, "I'm still here." The next morning, the dojo opened earlier than usual. On the bulletin board, a handwritten note. This Saturday, special foundation class for those who've never trained or once gave up. No signature, but everyone knew. That day's session passed in rare silence. No chatter. Every footstep on the mat felt louder. Every punch, every kick, carried its own weight. Drew was more focused. Riley stretched longer. Kenji lingered in transitions. In the corner, Nico opened his notebook. He wrote. He didn't throw a single strike today, but everyone heard the sound of a blow. After class, Martin made his rounds checking equipment. He stopped by the belt rack. Then he took a blank white strip of cloth and laid it gently on the table. Elijah passed by, noticed it, but said nothing, just nodded. A new student leaned toward Nico and asked, "Who is that man? Why does everyone go silent when he walks in?" Nico replied, "Because some people don't need to speak to be heard." That night, in his boarding room, Elijah stood in front of the mirror. He wore the old gi again. On the left side of his chest, the patch 3 red stripes and a single black slash was still there. He touched it gently, then smiled. Not the smile of victory, but the smile of someone who had survived and still chose to stand. It rained on Saturday morning, not hard, but steady, like an old coat worn by the sky frayed at the shoulders, mottled with wear, slowly soaking into the jackets of those who still chose to go outside. Elijah wore a hat. His cane tapped the sidewalk with a quiet talk. Talk. He wasn't in a hurry. People who've lived through being misnamed twice usually aren't. They walk as if rewriting something that had once been erased. The dojo was different that morning, brighter. Not because of the lights, but because of the eyes. A new row of chairs lined the wall. New faces sat beside the old. Nico sat next to Riley. Kenji brought a large water bottle, and Drew wore no belt, his GI fastened neatly, hands resting on his thighs. The bulletin board had been taken down. In its place was a blank white sheet of paper. Next to it, someone had laid a cloth strip marked with 3 red lines and a single black slash, as if that was the final language they all agreed to speak. Elijah entered. No one stood. But everyone looked. Not out of duty, but because no one wanted to miss the moment when someone begins without introduction. Sensei Martin stepped forward, nodded slightly, no long speech. This is a special class. No tests, no certificates, no belts, just a chance to start again or for the first time. He stepped back. Elijah stepped forward. He didn't shout, didn't instruct. He simply looked at each person, each face, then turned toward the large mirror and began to warm up. Every motion slow, rounded, unhurried, as if his body was opening a path for others to follow. Riley stepped forward to his right. Drew moved quietly to his left. Kenji and Nico joined behind, one after another. They followed. No one asked the name of the kata. No one needed to know its style. There was only movement, and the silence in each step. Every footfall on the mat sounded like the ticking of a slow clock, but not toward the end. Toward a moment someone might remember what they once let slip by. When the sequence ended, no one spoke. A soft breeze swept in through the open door. The scent of rain still clung to the sleeves. Elijah turned, nodded. The class bowed together. Then a new man, tall, weathered, in worn sneakers, stepped out from the row of seats. He bowed deeply. "I gave up 10 years ago, today. I'd like to stay." Elijah didn't reply, but he stepped back one pace, leaving a space in the line. The session ended, but no one rushed to leave. Some sat and wiped sweat. Others rolled up mats. Lena brought in a large teapot, placed it in the center of the room, and said nothing. Nico sat writing in his notebook. He never told anyone to bow, but everyone did. By late afternoon, the sky cleared, sunlight streamed through the window, painting a streak of gold across the floor. Elijah sat alone, looking out toward the courtyard. In his hands, a blank sheet of paper, just like the ones used for the dojo notice board. But this time, he wrote, not fast, not much, just one line. "I don't teach karate, I remind people not to forget." He folded the paper, set it on the table beside an old training glove. No one knew where it came from, but anyone who saw it understood this was the final note, though it carried no ending. That evening, the dojo closed early, but a small group of students stayed behind. Lena unrolled a mat, Riley brought pastries, Kenji played soft music. No one called for it, but they all showed up, as if bearing witness to something no one dared name. When Elijah left, he didn't take his cane. His hands were empty. His steps were slow, but upright. At the corner, he paused, looked back at the yellow light spilling from the dojo. Then he walked on, his shadow stretched behind him, then disappeared into the night. The next morning, a former student brought his son to the dojo. The boy was 6. Upon entering, he noticed the cloth with 3 red lines and a black slash. He asked, "What is that, Dad?" The father looked at it, then said, "It's the mark of someone who once chose to stand." Elsewhere, in a small apartment on the city's south side, Elijah poured tea. On the table, no black belt, no medals, just an old elastic band holding a notebook shut. He opened it. The first page was Riley's handwriting. The second, Nico's. The rest were blank. He picked up a pen, wrote nothing, just placed the pen against the paper, and left it there. Outside, the rain had returned. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher. One story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.